Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this talk by Maïko Le Lay today. Maïko's in her second year of postdoctoral fellowship at Duke University's Franklin Humanities Institute. In her first year here, she was mentored by Tommy DeFrance, who unfortunately has now departed from Duke for a position at Northwestern, and she is currently being mentored by Wesley Hogan. I did, however, want to just sort of say a few words about some of the nice things that Tommy has said about Maïko by way of introduction. He describes the way that she has started a new project on the identities and embodied and digital practices of Black and Japanese people globally. This project has involved multiple interviews. It was presented as a work in progress at a research forum at the Race Workshop, organized by Professor Bonilla Silva earlier last year, and during 2 undergraduate level guest lectures also. She's completed a robot test pilot project in collaboration with the Task Lab at UC Davis, and has stayed involved in online conference presentations and has joined the Minor Aesthetic Working Group as well as Global Blackness Working Group at Duke. Tommy also commends the way in which she was instrumental in the organization of the virtual programming of a CAD conference in February. She continued as part of the postdoc working group at Duke and organized a 3-day writing retreat in Hillsborough, where scholars were brought together and received writing support. She proudly has networked with students, staff, and faculty from many Duke departments, from FHI, from dance, from Asian and American studies, and the Keenan Institute, Computer Sciences and Engineering, Learning Innovation, the Thompson Writing Program, Classical Studies, Gender, Sexuality and Feminist Studies, Ethnomusicology, the Center, Computational Media and Arts, and Romance Studies. So this gives you, I think, a sense of the range of Maïko's interests. Wesley Hogan, who unfortunately can't be with us today, is Maïko's current faculty mentor, as I said, and really started in that role last year also. And she has written of Maïko. Maïko received her PhD in critical dance studies from the University of California, Riverside in 2020. Her doctoral research focused on hip-hop education, where she developed a curriculum called Embodied Hip-Hop Pedagogies, centering performance, self-awareness, hip-hop histories, and the impact of Western institutional spaces and epistemologies on moving bodies. After her doctoral studies, Le Lay completed a postdoctoral scholarship in the Connected Learning Lab at the University of California, Irvine. She has an MA in political sciences from the Université Catholique de Louvain in Belgium, and an MA in Media and Cultural Studies from the Université Paris-III Sorbonne Nouvelle. At Duke, she has convened the Embodied Pedagogies on and offline working group and drew in that interdisciplinary scholars together in the pandemic era to consider how university-based educators might better connect with students through embodied learning. As a postdoctoral fellow at FHI, over the last year and a half, Maïko has created an extraordinary oral history archive, interviewing over 40 people who identify both as Black and Japanese. The insightful questions she has brought to this work, drawn from critical race theory, post-colonial theory, embodiment studies, media studies, anthropology, Asian African diaspora studies, as well as her own experience as a dance scholar and dancer, has allowed her to conduct these 40 interviews, which under any circumstances would be a vast amount of work, but also with particular skill as an interviewer and sensitivity as a listener that engendered a trust among her narrators, has produced a remarkably nuanced and generative set of response that reflect a wide range of experiences among different generations and in different cultural settings. Today, Maïko is sharing some of the questions this body of evidence raises, as well as the innovative linguistic and theoretical tools she has created to better make sense of the data. Her work, centering members of the African diaspora, helps us to understand more fully how different cultures police the boundaries of Blackness and how people with multiple cultural identities not only navigate but innovate to make places of belonging for themselves in both physical and digital communities. It's been a rich and exciting conversation, says Wesley, with her during this period, listening and learning while she brings such creativity and analytical rigor to the work. Now, just briefly speaking in my own voice, let me say what a pleasure it has been to have Maïko in our midst, creating working groups, postdoctoral collectives, and writing retreats. She's been a part of a group of junior scholars at Duke who demonstrated a fairly consistent interest, interestingly and in an unplanned way, a fairly consistent interest in the theme of embodiment, something that takes into account the bodily markers of identification, sensation, and different ways of knowing that come to constitute embodied ontologies. Today, her talk is titled Moving in Between, How Black and Japanese Hafus Be, Know, and Move Polyculturally on and offline. Thank you. Welcome, Maïko.
Thank you very much, Ranji, for your thorough introduction and the whole FHI team for inviting me and supporting this research. As Ranji mentioned earlier, my PhD is in critical dance studies and my research focused on embodied hip-hop pedagogy. So as you can see by the title of this slide, I switched gears quite a bit. My new line of work focusing on the identities and digital and embodied practices of people who identify as Black and Japanese has started recently with my fellowship at Duke. What I will be presenting today are the preliminary findings collected from oral histories that I began in November 2021. My findings support that other studies on identity have shown, which is that identity is extremely complex and constantly moving. And this is a true work in progress. I'm still thinking through my research, and I would appreciate any feedback you have to offer. Next slide, please. I will start by providing some context on why I recently decided to start researching about Hafus. I'll also share some background about the term Hafu and some representative examples. Then I will explain my research questions and methods before going over emerging themes from interviews. Next slide, please. It almost became a necessity for me to study about people who identified as Hafu, which means ethnically half Japanese. So I'm a Hafu, half French, half Japanese. I was raised by my Japanese single mother in the Western world in France and Belgium and came to the US about 8 years ago. I have struggled with my bicultural identity since I was a kid, but the older I became and the longer I stayed in the US, the more difficult it has been to navigate the world, understand my identities, and not feel like I was having an identity crisis every day. I even created a multilingual dance performance during grad school where I expressed my biculturalism and difficulties. But, I was busy doing a PhD and kept these feelings in the back burner. And one day, one of my friends asked me about my identities, and I answered, "Oh, I'm half French, half Japanese." But then I corrected myself and said, well, actually, I'm full French and full Japanese. So these questions of biraciality became stronger over time. Next slide, please. But it wasn't until summer 2021 when I watched a documentary on Netflix about Naomi Osaka, the famous tennis player, that I saw an opportunity to bridge my personal feelings with research. Osaka's mother is Japanese and her father is Haitian. She was born in Japan, then raised on the tennis court in the US. Her main language is English, and she speaks some Japanese. Even though she chose to have a Japanese citizenship to represent Japan at tournaments, she identifies as Black, Japanese, and American because of her upbringing in the US. That documentary prompted me to write a short essay that connected her dance post on social media and her identities. When I started the piece on Naomi Osaka, I realized that there wasn't a lot of academic research about Hafus, and especially Black Hafus. The little research that I did find focused on those who lived in Japan. And I thought Blackness in Japan is very specific. And even so, someone can be Black because they're African American, but also from somewhere else, like Osaka, whose father is from Haiti. So I wanted to look at the similarities and differences among Black and Japanese people across the world and who are from different ages and origins. Next slide, please. Another reason why I chose this research is because in entertainment, social media, and athletics, being Blasian, so Black and Asian, has become very quote-unquote trendy. The trend notably started with the increased popularity of celebrities such as Tiger Woods, Naomi Campbell, Nicki Minaj, just to name a few. I wanted to problematize that, but also capitalize on the momentum to raise awareness about the diversity of experiences of Blasian and Black and Japanese in particular. Ultimately, my research has always strived to be equity-centered and within the realm of African diasporic studies. So it was natural for me to look at the Black and Japanese population first. And I felt that it was probably the most pressing as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. I wanted to offer a little bit of background about the politics of the term Hafu and a couple of examples from public figures to help frame this project. In Japan, people who are ethnically half Japanese are called Hafu, which derives from the English word half. It is a very common term in Japan and one I personally grew up with. However, lately, some have stopped embracing this term because being half someone carried with it a negative connotation that suggests that the individual is not whole or complete, which reduces them to being less than. For some Hafus, being called Hafu means they're not considered fully Japanese, further emphasizing the state of limbo and perpetual search for acceptance and belonging they already struggle with. The term daburu, double, has gained some traction amongst ethnically half Japanese people, but isn't as used. The word Hafu emerged in Japan in the 70s to account for the increasing numbers of mixed-race babies born out of relationship between Japanese women and US soldiers occupying Japan after World War II. Although many of these children were half Black because their fathers were African-American soldiers, children were usually considered Hafu only if they were from white and Japanese ancestry, effectively invisibilizing Hafus who were Black. White and Japanese Hafus have been considered the most kawaii, cute kids, who would turn into the most bijin, handsome adults. Tall, white skin, big eyes, and a high nose. Being Hafu is intimately tied to dominant ideologies of whiteness, an idea that is still somewhat anchored in Japanese society, due in part to it being perpetuated by the Japanese media. Being Hafu also comes with a long list of expectations. The ideal Hafu should have white and Japanese traits with straight Black hair, and they should be raised in school in Japan, live in Japan, they should speak, read, and write fluent Japanese, and they should practice Japanese customs and traditions. So according to these criteria, neither Naomi Osaka nor I were considered real ideal Hafu in the Japanese imaginary, effectively othering us. However, with the rise of foreigners and non-white Hafus in Japan, the ideal Japanese imaginary is changing. For example, some Black Hafus have gone into modeling and have very successful careers, complicating the standards of beauty we just discussed. I've just problematized the term Hafu, and yet I still use it. I recognize that by calling my participant Black Hafu tends to emphasize the problematic racial politics of the term, and that is diminutive. However, I didn't want to use the word Blasian because it encompasses mixed Black with non-Japanese heritage. So please think of the term Hafu in this presentation as a placeholder till I find a vocabulary that can better portray my participants' identities and embodied and digital praxis. Next slide, please. Collectively, however, Hafus are considered second-class citizens. Black Hafus endure much more discrimination than others. They must constantly justify their Japanness and must contend with being denied housing, being bullied both in school and in the workplace. An unfortunate example of this is what happened when Ariana Miyamoto, a Black and Japanese beauty pageant contestant, became the first Hafu to be crowned Miss Japan Universe in 2015. It wasn't long after her victory that a large part of the Japanese population began to contest her victory on the grounds of not being a real representative. Regardless of the increase of Black and Japanese Hafu athletes, they still face difficulties because of their ethnicities. The physical attributes are celebrated and they're adored by the Japanese media and people, but their support quickly turns when the athletes don't win. Japanese audience were proud of Osaka, whose hair was styled in red and black braids, as a representative of Japan when she lit the torch at the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, until she lost unexpectedly early. Losing this early, she can't be Japanese, was a popular refrain not long after she lost, emphasizing the pressure to embody and perform excellence. Unlike Osaka or Miyamoto, who have faced a lot of criticism, Rui Hachimura is loved by Japanese people, notably because, unlike Osaka, he was raised in Japan and speaks fluent Japanese. Some people commented that the Olympics should have chosen Hachimura to light the torch, because at least he speaks Japanese. Later on this presentation, I will discuss how gender affects the way Japanese people perceive these celebrities. Next slide, please. Whereas the ideal Hafu is attached to whiteness, the ideal Black Hafu is attached to the idea of popular Black American cultures and celebrities, such as famous hip-hop artists, basketball or baseball players, and so forth. There's a form of romanticization and fetishization. An African American Hafu is considered way cooler, in a sense, than a Hafu whose origins are from the African continent. For example, Ria, an influencer, said, "America shika shiranai kara. America is the best country. アメリカ人は amazing. アメリカ人になりたい、admire マインが結構あるので、ナイジェリアと日本ハーフって言うと、ナイジェリアってどこ？アフリカ？貧しいサバンナとこだよね。アフリカ人やば。アメリカンって聞かれると、sometimes I try answered yes. で、sometimes you. リアクションは、おー、かっこいい。だから自分のアイデンティティコンプレックス。だからめんどくさいからアメリカ人って言ってた。So here, Ria tells us that because there's this mentality in Japan that America is amazing, it's the best country, American people are, great, this is admiration. When she says she's half Nigerian, they're like, oh, where is Nigeria? In Africa? Oh my gosh, this is where this poor savannah place, that must suck. But when they ask, are you American? Sometimes she just says yes, because then the reaction is, oh, that's super cool. And so that creates an identity complex. But also she's just fed up of these stereotypes that she just says she's American instead of Nigerian. Finally, Japanese history has an impact on its current social climate. Japan was a very insular island with relatively strict foreign immigration till today. It can be considered racially homogenous, and many Japanese people like to keep it that way. Overall, there's an anti-gaijin, anti-foreigner sentiment across the country, and it goes beyond anti-Blackness or anti-Africanness. People whose origins are from the Southeast Asian countries or countries like China or Korea, who have had a history of war or competition with Japan, can be highly discriminated against, and perhaps even more than Black people or mixed Black Hafus. Overall, Hafu presents a conundrum between coolness and gaijin-ness and can therefore be adored or rejected at the same time. Next slide, please. For this project, I identified 4 categories of participants. The first are Hafus. They are adults who identify as Black and Japanese. They could be from African American descent or any other African diasporic descent. The second are parents, either Black or Japanese, parents of minors who identify as Black and Japanese. I think it's important to learn from people who chose to get together with someone from a different race and learn about their experience raising mixed children. These 2 categories belong in the personal sphere. The next 2 categories belong in the public sphere. Community organizers, they are part or at the head of organizations that support Black and Japanese people. And then influencers, people who actively use their biracial identities online. I'm interested in examining how Black and Japanese people deploy their Hafu-ness in online public spaces. Next slide, please. My research questions are, how do Hafus be, know, and move in the world? Put differently, how do Hafus navigate their identities in different cultural spaces? It also asks, what is the role of social media in Hafus' lives? I argue that people's perception impacts their way of belonging and navigating the world, that social media provide opportunities for community building globally, racial equity advocacy, and a deeper sense of belonging. And that being a Hafu means making a new sense of the world, aka polyculturalism. So what does this latter mean? Next slide, please. Biracial kids tend to struggle navigating how to be, know, and move in different cultural settings. For example, at home, I was asked to be quiet, still to show respect, while at school, my behaviors and ways of moving were considered too Japanese. And because of our challenges growing up as biracial kids and negotiating how to move in different institutional cultural spaces, I find it useful to think of us as polycultural movers. Vijay Prashad and Kelley developed the concept of polyculturalism to refer to the idea that individuals' relationship to cultures shift and are partial and plural. It emphasizes the interconnectedness between different cultural groups, as opposed to multiculturalism, which celebrates the separateness between various cultural identities. Polyculturalism helps explain how mixed-race people like Osaka or me navigate multiple identities and move in different cultural settings. Polyculturalism is used in Prashad's book, Everybody is Kung Fu Fighting, where he examined Afro-Asian connection. In one of Kelley's articles, he wrote, "I've got people in me." This quote resonates with me because it shows all the cultural and ethnic influences that one embodies, and it complicates the notion of ethnic purity. Polyculturalism lets a person embody multiplicity and fluidity in context-specific and involving situation and still be whole. Polyculturalism provides room for movement and freedom of expression. Next slide, please. These quotes might better represent how I understand polyculturalism in the context of this work. It's been more recent where I felt more connected to the term multiracial versus biracial or just Black and Japanese because it feels very narrow. I know that I'm not just Black and Japanese in my own ancestry. It doesn't give a full picture. I recently started reading about the Ainu people of Hokkaido and their ancestry is blended with Russian. Looking at my grandparents, both who are from Hokkaido, there's just such a vastness. Even on my dad's side, who was African American, some of my ancestry is from Ireland and Native. It feels like I'm discounting them. In the case of Charlene, I see her way of being polycultural as appreciating her multiple cultural heritage and learning to embody them. Next slide, please. Are you more Japanese or more American? That is the stupidest questions I get all the time. I am both. Questions like that are very offensive and lead to identity crisis all the time because it implies you have to be one or the other, or you don't have a grip on who you are as a person. Luna says, we were told that you're going to have to choose a nationality, which is such a dilemma for someone who doesn't know a world of one, a monolingual, monocultural, monoracial world. We don't know what that is, so picking a side is stressful when you're so used to being mixed and having access to both worlds. For Kelley and Luna, I associate their polyculturalism as their inherent doubleness that they embody and the way they simply cannot move in the world without the lens of being mixed. Another way of thinking about polyculturalism is through polyrhythm in music. A jazz band, for example, everybody's working together. There's not like an individual musician or instrument. It's a combination that creates the melody and the magic, and it's fluid and hybrid. And because of my background as a dancer and dance scholar, I like to think of polyculturalism like a dance containing both improvised moves and curated choreography. Like jazz music, polycultural moves are a form of never-ending call and response between different cultural moves and identities. Next slide, please. In the context of this research, being polyculturally means a perpetual search for belonging. It means you're negotiating between feeling included, excluded, and looking for representation. So people that look like you or people that have similar challenges, both on and offline. I have chosen some representative quotes to frame this idea. Growing up in a Black community in the inner city of LA, I didn't get the chance to be mixed. It's been hard to find my place as someone with a light skin and a Japanese name. It's not until my 30s that I've started embracing being multicultural. So living in a Black community, Tomoko felt almost pressured to keep her Japanese cultural heritage aside, and she was always fully aware of her difference because of her appearance and name. This quote represents the ongoing questioning and in-betweenness that Black Hafus go through and the evolving journeys about finding their place in society. They may feel lost, so they want to find a community that will welcome them for who they are. And this is where social media or awareness of public figures such as Naomi Osaka or Rui Hachimura comes in. Next slide, please. Now, knowing polyculturally means perception. Being hyper-aware of the way others' perception impacts you. Hafus live in the world with a critical race awareness, which affects the way they belong and navigate the world. Some people walk past and say, gaijin. That word shouldn't be applied to my kids, says Kalo, a parent, whose kids have grown up in Japan, but they're always seen as foreigners. Next slide, please. And then finally, this quote from Chanda represents what moving polyculturally means. I'm a chameleon. Chameleons change color depending on the environment. Navigating spaces as a mixed person through code switching. Indeed, many Black Hafus are very good at reading rooms and moving their bodies according to a given social cultural space. Some Black Hafus move polyculturally by serving as an advocate of racial equity, both on and offline. Next slide, please. My primary method was gathering oral histories and conducting a thematic analysis. I've interviewed 40 people via Zoom who are from the US, Brazil, Zambia, Ghana, Nigeria, Benin, Cameroon, Japan, and France, and who are currently living in the US, Brazil, Hong Kong, Hawaii, Thailand, Japan, UK, France at the time of the interview. The age varied between 20 and 70 years old, and 2/3 were female. Gender and sexualities, identities are intersectional and diverse, but my participants did not identify themselves as non-binary. I like to think that my research methods has a polycultural lens too. I attempt to share raw stories, being okay with it being complex, messy, plural, showing both opportunities and challenges experienced by a diverse group of Hafu people, whether they're from Asia, America, Europe, or Africa. It is polycultural because it aims to move away from the model idea of the Hafu and its relationship to whiteness, but also to help us be more critical about mixed identities as not always something that is exotic or trendy, like it is often portrayed. Ultimately, my goal is to learn about the different facets of polyculturalism and storytelling as data. In terms of social media analysis, I asked my interviewees about their social media praxis, and I've been surfing on Facebook and Instagram. In the future, I plan to complement my research with fieldwork and a deeper social media analysis, where I analyze trends of hashtags and look at celebrities' Hafu profiles to understand digital points of connections between Hafu worldwide. Next slide, please. So, navigating polyculturalism offline. How Hafus are perceived by their Black or Japanese communities considerably impact the way they feel like they belong to and navigate their communities and the world more broadly. There was one emerging theme that stood out to me hearing my interviewees who have lived long-term or currently live in Japan, and it is how gender affects Hafu's sense of belonging and navigation. Being a male Black Hafu can be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, many boys and men are victims of racial profiling, experiencing similar consequences as Black men in Western countries such as the US. On the other hand, Black Hafus can be put on a pedestal for their strong physical attributes and coolness. But again, these ideas are tied to Japanese people's ideal American imaginary. Men have the pressure to live up to these ideals and stereotypes of being funny, entertaining, good at sports and dance, and so forth. Being a female Black Hafu in Japan isn't easy either. Ria, our Nigerian Japanese influencer, shared that as a teen, she was always friend-zoned by the boys in her circle. They wouldn't consider dating her because she was not even considered a girl, whereas her brother was cool and handsome. But she took this negative experience and used it as fuel. She entered the Miss Universe Japan competition to show that being Black with Afro hair is beautiful. Now she inspires many Black and Japanese girls all around Japan and elsewhere. Similarly, Kalo, one of the parents, was extremely saddened by young Japanese children bullying her daughter at school, while his son was admired by his classmates. Like Ria, he decided to use his children's experience as a teaching moment. He wrote several children's books to educate people about racism, and his books are top sellers in Japan today. A final example is from Luna. People are kind of enamored by the look. It's like an exotic vacation of being mixed race. When Japanese men approach me, it feels like cosplay to them. They change intonation. Yo, sister. They're speaking to me because they like hip hop culture. They want a Black woman, but I'm as close as Black as they can get. Here, Luna describes the exotization and hypersexualization that some Black Hafu women go through. Luna owns a bookstore that specializes in English books and in books about tattoos. As you may know, tattoos are extremely taboo in Japan, even more so for women, because they're considered to be associated with Yakuza, the gangster culture. Luna has been using her bookstore as a space to explore Japanese womanhood and speak up about diverse racial and gender discrimination she has faced as a Black and Japanese tattooed woman. In short, physical attributes and gender impact people's perception of mixed race individual, which influences their sense of belonging in Japan. However, many of my interviewees have used their experience as motivation, developing nonprofit organizations to raise awareness about Blackness and Africanness in Japan, creating Black and Japanese community groups, writing books, participating in beauty pageants to empower others who face similar challenges. Next slide, please. Moving outside of Japan, what stood out to me in Western contexts was the paradox between Hafus being read as Black and not Black enough. For example, Molly said, "I'm challenged by the Black community of not being Black. I tell someone I'm Black, they go, no, you're not. I think it's this boxing in of people, the stereotype of what Black is. My mother-in-law said, I don't see you as Black. We all know what that means. My skin's not dark and my hair's not kinky, and that's kind of messed up." Many people like Molly were raised with Japanese customs and traditions at home. Not being seen as belonging to the Black community pushed Molly to identify uniquely as Black as an adult today. However, for many others, the fact that they were not perceived as Black by the Black community caused anxiety, shame, and overall feelings of exclusion. For example, Ben didn't know any Black person outside of his father. Even though he read up on the Black movement, he said that he would be lying if he identified with their struggle because, quote, "When I was in Japan, I was simply a Japanese kid who happened to have a Black color," end quote. So his knowledge of Black culture was all through books, not through experiences. And he's proud to be half Black, but he identifies as Japanese. Quote, "I know of the Black experience, but I don't know the Black experience." So navigating polyculturalism for them means a lifelong evolving process of relating and understanding their mixed heritage. Now, in the US specifically, a common occurrence was the idea of boxing Black Hafu as one racial identity based on their skin color and appearance. For example, Jiru, a Hafu living on the East Coast, was surprised when a Black colleague wanted him to identify uniquely as Black because we need more of us. A different example was from Tomoko, who became upset when during an exit survey at a store, the staff automatically assumed she was Black. She started to speak in Japanese to make it a sort of a teaching moment, showing it wasn't okay to assume how people identify based on their appearance. Shiro said, "I'm super sensitive to how I present and how I'm perceived. I'm a little careful about going to Chinatown. I could look like I'm going to take your purse. I've got in an elevator before and had some people clutch their purse to their chest. I'm aware that I'm tall and big, so the Japanese part of me makes the accommodation." Many Hafus told me that even though they don't necessarily feel Black, they're assumed to be by other racial groups that they are. They're in many ways forced to negotiate with negative stereotypes such as danger, hypersexuality, and move accordingly, dancing, balancing, tiptoeing between their Japaneseness and Blackness. So for Hafus living in the US, there is this paradox between, on the one hand, feeling excluded by the Black community for not being Black enough, and on the other hand, to be always seen as Black and negotiate having to live up to the expectation of Black culture or dealing with the oppression of being Black in Western countries. Next slide, please. Finally, I wanted to show how navigating polyculturalism offline constitutes a combination of, one, being critically aware of the racial polarity they embody and the impact of different racial hierarchies on the sense of belonging and navigating. Two, their ability to perform and code switch depending on the cultural space my participants were located. And three, finding spaces of comfort where they could truly be themselves as Black Hafu. Trina said, "As Japanese, I sit at the top of the Asian social hierarchy, while as a Black woman, I'm at the bottom. So I embody a social and racial polarity. Everything exists in between it, but I think it's fun because I can be very creative between the two." Being a Black Hafu is socially and racially complex because in a place like the US, they are, as one of my interviewees put it, a minority within a minority. even though being Japanese can come with some privileges due to the popularity of Japanese pop culture or the model minority myth. My interviewees who lived in different countries in Africa shared that their Asianness was often treated or mistaken as whiteness, causing both tensions and privileges. Also, being Asian in many parts of Africa can be dangerous as they are perceived as the neo-colonizers. However, it is important to note that in some contexts, being Malaysian is considered cool. Therefore, the racial hierarchies and dynamics we are familiar in the US do not necessarily operate the same in different countries. And because of these various social, cultural, and racial realities, Hafus have learned to perform and code switch to navigate these spaces. Kanako said, "I perform Japaneseness. My body acts differently in Japanese spaces by physically trying to make myself smaller and less noticeable and more like the stereotypical, like having your hands gather, holding your cheek up, holding your rice bowl in a certain way, bowing and smiling and staying quiet and not really voicing your opinion. I can start to perform the ideal state of physical traits and habits of what I think to be, of what I've learned to be, the ideal Japanese woman." For my interviewees, performing or code switching was necessary to feel like they belong in different spaces. Ultimately, the ability to embody doubleness and code switch gives them a sense of empowerment. They feel that it's a power, a privilege to be able to move and act polyculturally and through multiple cultural settings. In many ways, they saw themselves as daburu, double, as opposed to hafu, half. Finally, because it can be overwhelming trying to fit in, Hafus have searched for spaces of comfort. These are spaces where they feel like they belong without having to perform, or places that make them feel like home. For example, Asha told me that the first time he got off the plane in Hawaii, he instantly felt like it was his Mecca because he saw other Japanese with darker skin and he didn't feel alone. Ben, who grew up in Okinawa in post-war Japan, used to always walk behind his mother as a child and crouched and looked down to the floor to avoid eye contact with Okinawans, to protect his mother from being judged for having a Black child. It has only been as an adult living in California that he could embrace his true self and move more freely. Generally speaking, Hafus who were raised or who have lived in places that are known to be more culturally diverse, such as California or Hawaii, have had more positive experiences than others who were in Japan, for example. However, some of those who left Japan or who haven't lived there for long term, there is a void that they need to fill. And despite the gaze of Japanese people in the train, the smell of the ocean and the shrine bring them a sense of comfort, which they do not find anywhere else. For some, Japan becomes this place of comfort, the home to go back to. We'll see in the next section how spaces of comfort don't necessarily have to be geographical, physical spaces. Digital spaces can act as spaces of comfort as well. Next slide, please. I will now discuss the role of social media in Hafu's lives and examine how issues of belonging, perception, and navigation transpire through their social media use. What I ultimately hope to get at here is that social media and digital spaces constitute spaces of refuge and creativity for Hafus. To start, I wanted to show 2 Instagram videos posted by one of the influencers I interviewed. Pele was raised in Ghana but currently lives in Tokyo with his Japanese mom. His most successful videos are the ones where he either portrays the cultural differences between Japanese and Ghanaian people, or his satirical videos where he shows how Japanese people perceive him and people from Africa more generally. His main goal with his video is to, quote, properly capture our experiences and sharing a culture in a comic way. Christina, if you could click on the first link. Great, and add the sound, that would be great. Oh yeah, I don't think we can hear the.
こうやって作れないの？こうですか。こうやって。やったことないですね。ちょっとやってみます。すごい！あら、すごいじゃん。ありがとうございます。僕のアフリカポテンシャルを感じさせてくれてありがとうございます。さすがアフリカ人やるね。さっきの人がライター貸してくれたんで。すいません、ライター貸してもらえますか？
Okay, thank you. In this video, we see how Japanese people perceive the African continent and people from Africa. In a different post, Pele highlighted the paradox that Japanese people thought Africa was dangerous when Japan has so many life-threatening earthquakes. In another recent post, he shows himself being chased by lions, elephants, and rhinos to emphasize the supposed fear of Africa. According to my interviewees, many Japanese people perceive people from the African continent in a negative and stereotypical light. Indeed, we saw earlier that Ria used to hide the fact that she was from Nigeria and instead pretended to be Black American. Another interviewee from Zambia purposefully identified as someone from Africa as opposed to a Black man because he feels that he has the duty to improve the image of Africa. And we can click on the second link, please. Yeah, and if we can.
だってそんなことやる子供いないもん。いいんだよ。子供はいないもん、そんなことやる。
Let's replay it really quickly.
やだよ。何？だってそんなことやる子供いないもん。いいんだよ。子供はいないもん、そんなことやる。
The second video is of Pele and his mother embracing and walking. It shows to me that despite the challenges he faces in Japan, and despite the fact that Japanese people wouldn't technically approve of such way of being in public, Pele moves in the world the way he intends to. It seems that his critical awareness on perception empowers him to push the boundaries of how to move in the world. Navigating polyculturalism online in Pele's case means posting videos of what he goes through every day to rebel against these expectations by showing other kinds of possibilities. His fans appreciate his videos for portraying realness in a comic way. And Pele shared that using social media was a coping mechanism for his homesickness and an effective way to stay connected to his Ghanaian friends and roots. In a way, for Pele, social media constitutes a space of comfort and refuge and where he can let out his creativity. Next slide, please. I also wanted to shed light on other ways social media has served as a space of comfort, refuge, and connection for Hafus. Tomoko said, "Finding community online has been really helpful. It's easier to be vulnerable and be honest about your feelings. I thought me and my cousins were the only Black and Asians. I was very isolated, and there wasn't social media to find people like us. Now you see many celebrities or athletes that are Blasian. Today, walking down the streets in Japan, we're being stopped by other Hafus that are excited to meet us, and we can exchange social media accounts and keep in touch. I felt like I found my tribe." I've seen that belonging is intimately tied to the question of feeling represented. Social media and public figures have enabled that lately. For example, Kalo, one of the parents, mentioned that his Black and Japanese son was a fan of Rui Hachimura because Hachimura is somebody that looks like him. So who else is like me is a common question within the Black Hafu community. For many, seeing themselves represented online platforms has considerably helped them navigate their biculturality. Feeling represented and sharing similar challenges on social media is validating, and my interviewees no longer feel alone in these experiences. Indeed, older Hafus told me how they are happy to see that the younger generation, there are more resources and representation out there for them. Back in the day, they didn't have access to the stories of other Hafus globally. Many of my interviewees follow other Blasian influencers. Some have joined Facebook groups such as the Hafu or Hapa group because they were motivated to connect with others, even if they weren't in the same physical vicinity. Some of the influencers I interviewed made it a point to become role models and advocate for the Black and Japanese community. For example, Lynn, a mother from UK, said that she creates YouTube videos to reach out to show that, quote, it's not strange to have a Japanese husband and Blasian kids. She would get messages saying, I'm so happy that you did that because my grandchildren are mixed and I don't know how to navigate that. For many influencers located in Japan, they've used social media to push Black and Japanese parents of Black Hafu kids to meet up in person and connect in real life. While social media can also negatively impact individuals, for Pele and others, social media has been a space with new possibilities to exist as a Black Hafu in Japan and as well. It is also a digital space that brings comfort through representation and connection. Thus, navigating polyculturalism online in the context of this research means finding community as well as learning from others through videos and posts and eventually connecting. And last slide, please. To summarize, this presentation examined how Hafus exist in the world and navigate polyculturalism in person and online. Being polycultural means going through an evolving journey of accepting both Black and Japanese cultural identities wherever you are, while constantly negotiating the search of belonging. It also means that one is critically aware of others' perceptions without letting it beat you. Even though at first their ways of being and knowing can be restricted by society because they can feel boxed within a certain racial, ethnic, or cultural identity, many break away and find different ways of moving. Indeed, Hafu use their experience to find their physical and or virtual spaces of comfort, refuge, and creativity, and educate, advocate, and influence others. I want to reiterate that age, generation, geographical and social cultural contexts impact Black Hafu's ways of being, knowing, and moving differently. For example, a post-war Black and Japanese person in Okinawa with no social media or no one to turn to will have a very different experience from a 21-year-old living in New York or LA today. I was interested in these differences and points of affinities amongst the broad range of experiences since they exist on a spectrum. This presentation also touched upon issues of model Hafu and the digital polycultural possibilities of social media to build Black Hafu's communities globally. Polyculturalism in our context is like an improved and choreographed dance with call and responses between cultures, as well as a constant push-pull tensions between how one feels and how others feel about you. Yet what came out of my interviews is that being Blasian is a new way of making sense of the world, as one of the parents put it really well, which is more like a blend, hybrid, and multiple. Finally, this research bridges the field of Asian and African diasporic studies and digital humanities with tools from visual and embodied studies. My work helps nuance Blackness outside of the US context and Japanness outside of Japan. It has the potential to expand our collective understanding of what it means to be Black, what it means to be Japanese, and what it means to be Hafu globally across different settings. Thank you very much for listening, and I welcome any comments, suggestions, and questions. Thank you so much. So basically, I I wanted to invite some of my interviewees as part of this open Q&A so that they can, directly voice and react, and also maybe respond to some of your questions. But yeah, let's have maybe our panelists sharing their thoughts quickly, and then I can answer the Q&A questions right after that.
I just wanted to say it's Lisa Shanta Aono, and I'm actually calling in from Japan. So you might hear a little bit of sleepiness in my voice, but what an excellent presentation. As a parent of Hafu twins, I myself learned something from hearing your presentation. So just congratulations on that. I liked what you said about the fact that, the different countries, and I know it's strange, but I never thought about that, like how it's seen in different countries and the African side of it. So I just wanted to congratulate you because I'm learning as well.
Thank you so much, Lisa, and thank you again for your contribution.
Hello, Annette Furiyama here. I'm also mixed. I'm mixed Jamaican Indian, but was raised and born and raised in England, and I also have a Japanese husband and 2 Japanese kids. So the experience of not being Black enough when I was growing up is what I was told about when I was growing up, and it's also what my children are being told now, that they're part English, Black, Japanese, African, and Jamaican. So I enjoyed the fact that, and I agree, sorry, not enjoyed that, I agreed the fact that different people who have been through different or brought up with different culture because they've been born between different cultures during the generations, it was for me an identity crisis when I was growing up, even though I look Black mostly than Asian or Indian, should I say. My grandmother was Indian, mum's half. And for my kids, especially my daughter at the moment, who's 19, she's going through a bit of an identity crisis at the moment, even though she's at uni. I thought it would be gone since she went from school, but yeah, she's got identity crisis even though she's at uni. My son hasn't got that issue yet because he looks basically like his dad, but with Afro hair. But I have enjoyed your presentation. It's great being part of it as well. So thank you for inviting me to be part of your research, being Black and British as well. So yeah, we are due back to go to Japan in December. So I'm assuming that's going to be another issue for my son who doesn't understand that there is going to be a difference of how people will clutch their bags when they're seeing everything. He's lived his life mostly in England. So, but yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you, Annette. Yeah, and now that you say that, I feel like as a parent, you probably have to prepare your children for that cultural clash going back to Japan versus, living in a Western country, or like wherever you go. I feel like as a mixed Black and Japanese person, you have to navigate that gaze, and which clashes with how you identify yourself, right? So, thank you for that comment.
Yeah, I identify myself as a mix, by the way, because obviously my granny's Asian, my mum's half Asian, Indian, and my dad's half white and Black mix. So in my whole of my family, it's a lot very different, different people and different cultures. So it's polycultural, I suppose, for want of a better word.
Yeah. Trisha, you want to say something?
I think you did an amazing job. もう本当にありがとうございました. Like, it was a very great representation, and everything you said and decided to highlight was just so accurate. And I'm humbled that you decided to focus in on this population I happen to be a part of. And I'm excited about your research because I know it's going to do my career field wonders as we, 'cause I'm a counselor here in San Antonio. So as we, as professional counselors, learn how to work with different racial groups, understanding the complexities of polycultural or bicultural individuals is extremely important with the way the trend is moving in the US demographics. So again, thank you so much for doing this. It was great.
Thank you. Yeah, and Yeah, I cannot imagine like how complex it is to, you know, work in counseling and having that added layer of, right, you know, mixed race, multiculturalism and all that stuff coming into play. And especially with people who move from one context to the other, that makes it really complicated. Yeah.
You did beautifully. Thank you so much.
I appreciate it. Anybody else wants to share, or should I go into the questions?
Oh, I just wanted to add another aspect of the fact that this might be raised in questions, but I don't know if it will be, of the fact that now, as you mentioned in your presentation about now, it's kind of become fashionable. And even in the Black community, the expectations of what being Hafu or Blasian is. So for my families, we discussed it, I think, about the fact that there was this expectation that the kids would look lighter with silkier hair. And I notice this whenever I go into forums about Blasians, or I'm using the term Blasian because, you know, and what I notice is now it's become, you know, like almost like a fashion thing. And I think there's a lot of people that have to come to terms with their Blackness and colorism and texturism, because, you know, my kids are gloriously dark and they've got glorious afros. But even in my own family, there were some people that had reservations about that because that's not what they expected. And I worry with this new wave of a lot of people being excited to have Blasian kids, quote unquote, that there might be a lot of issues for a next generation who have these parents who haven't adjusted to their colorism and hair texturism. And I do worry for the next generation of kids that are coming up. I don't know if that makes sense for any of the panelists on here.
Yeah, and thank you so much for raising that, because I do feel like phenotype really impacts, you know, so the way you look, whether you have Afro hair versus not Afro hair, lighter skin versus darker skin, considerably impact that, you know, people's perception of you and the way you can belong, both for the Japanese side of their heritage or the Black side. So if you have, let's say, straight Black hair, you're not Black enough. If you have Afro hair in Japan, then you're definitely not Japanese. And I think also some people, and I'm not criticizing it, but I think a lot of people have played into that role of Blasian being cool and trendy as a tool to survive or to influence others. And so I'm definitely not criticizing, and I'm just pointing out that it's been a necessity for people to maybe navigate this trend and go into modeling, for example, really play into that, because they have to, because of these markers of society that makes you cannot be one or the other. So I need to be this cool Blasian model, you know, and so that I find it really interesting, and I haven't really gone deeper on that subject yet. And I think maybe doing more social media analysis will help with that. But thank you so much for pointing that out, indeed. So maybe I'm going to start addressing, we have 3 comments and questions in the Q&A. So the first one is, do we see signs of a mixed Asian Black population on the rise in Africa, where more Chinese workers have gone to work due to the Belt and Road Initiative? What about in China with an influx of African professionals and students? This is a great question. I actually don't know at all. I'm not an expert on this particular topic, but I assume that in China, like in Japan, there are people that are mixing and parenting Black and Asian kids as well. So I'm assuming that part is still true. Now, do Chinese people were immigrating in Africa for work mix with the Black population? From my small knowledge of going to different places in Africa and my mom living there for a few years, I would conservatively say the answer is largely no. Because again, you are in this strata, right? As an immigrant, you are the foreign expat, and you usually tend to stay in that community. You have more means than the Black population, so you don't necessarily meet them unless they are your subordinates. So that's one thing. And you know, some people come with their families, period. Like a lot of expats I've seen going to Africa for a certain number of years usually move with their whole family. So I would say conservatively, there must be people, of course they do. And I know Japanese people who have moved to Africa and built a family there successfully and stayed there. But and so some of my interviewees have grown up there and so forth. But it's not as common probably as yeah. The second question is, are there examples of Japanese media that attempt to address the polyculturalism of Japan? Well, first, I don't think the term polyculturalism is really known outside of the academic circle. I just really use it. I feel like it's way more representative of what people of multiple cultural heritage go through than any other terms I've seen so far. And of course, yes, there are Japanese media, and I would say especially social media platforms, whether it's YouTube videos, short series and documentaries, posts, or, you know, kind of popular medias that try to advocate for more racial diversity in Japan. But on the other hand, they can also show how racist Japan really is. So it's, you know, you've seen people do like street mic stuff and just would ask random people in the streets, you know, how did you feel about Ariana Miyamoto winning Miss Universe Japan? Or how do you feel about Naomi Osaka lighting the torch? And while some people are very excited and say, yeah, Japan, you know, this is the new Japan, we have way more foreigners and we need to embrace diversity, the majority still are like, no, these are not Japanese, period. Like, it's not only because you don't look like Japanese, it's just you cannot represent Japan. You haven't lived in Japan long enough. Or even if you did, then the phenotype comes into play and you're like, there's just this barrier, this boundary, this idea of what being Japanese is. And if you're outside of that, you're automatically excluded from that community, basically. So, of course, Japanese media more and more have raised that, but I wouldn't say probably not as much as big channels. It's more like the underground folks who do popular stuff on social media, and they do amazing work. And yeah, and a lot of my interviewees actually who are Black and Japanese living in Japan have participated in these kinds of platforms. So this is how I found them too, because they spoke up. And we have a comment here saying that, yeah, that in Korea, there's been similar instances where it show how being Black in Korean is only considered you're being Black. Yeah. So I guess when you're in Korea, when you're in Japan, if you have a darker skin, if you're mixed Black, then you're automatically associated with being Black, even though you feel Japanese or you can feel Korean and you feel more Asian, period, because you grew up with Asian traditions and customs and you only speak Japanese or Korean, but you're not considered being that because of the way you look. And that's true. Apparently it's true for other countries as well. Yeah, I'm sure Korea and Japan and China have very similar instances. So would love to learn more about other countries and how it is. I just started with Japan because of my cultural background, but I'm sure there's way more to unpack in other countries as well. And I think, yes, please go ahead.
Oh no, I was also going to say, my background is Black British Caribbean. My mum's from Jamaica. And when she shows people pictures of my kids, they're like, nah, they're not Japanese, where? And so it's, how can I put it? It's hard because when I go back to England, everyone's like, it's a slang term, it's a colloquialism, but why are you begging it? Because now that it's fashionable, quote unquote, to be Asian, if my kids say that they're Japanese, people are like, no, why are you begging it? You don't look Japanese. You've got, like I always say, gloriously, but you've got dark skin. And that's also the perception in other countries as well. So it's kind of really hard because in Japan, they don't look Japanese. In England, they don't look Japanese. So I think it will be hard for them to find a resting place where people will be able to say, okay, they are Japanese. But I'm very grateful, as you pointed out in your lecture, about Rura Hachimura, who we always take the kids to his basketball games when we're able to, and Naomi Osaka, and they have been absolutely groundbreaking for Hafu kids, because now people can understand what it means to be a Hafu kid. And yeah, like you said in your lecture, it's really very, very, very important. They're very important role models. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think what shows is that when you don't find a physical space where you feel like you belong and you can truly be yourself, then people turn into the digital space. And back in the days, people didn't have these online platforms to connect, but with social media, with globalization, people have the tool to connect and learn about others' experiences. So even though they might not be a physical geographical space where you're like, I'm accepted here or I'm accepted there, you're always kind of in this in-between zone. At least online, you can feel points of connections with others and you don't feel so alone. So I think that's a game changer for a lot of people of our generations and future generations. So that's huge.
May I interject?
Yes, please.
Hello, I'm Jabari Chimura. And so one aspect of, I identify as, at least in America, as Blasian. I do use that term. And so I think so during, first of all, I think, thank you as well for this great field of research topic that you're bringing to the forefront, especially at a major institution like this where it could have a lot of eyes. I do feel like part of the interview process, and actually these discussions overall, sometimes I feel like my answers may not connect with others, in the sense that I have been, and I also recognize that I have a certain level of privilege of looking mixed and perhaps being treated more like a biracial person than one or the other. And I have also had the experience of not being rejected by my families or anything like that. So overall, I have a very positive experience. And I also do want to highlight that I want to acknowledge that being biracial and being mixed, or however you want to identify, Black and Japanese, is a very central part of my identity. And it not only helps in who I am as a person, but also in my field of study. I work at another major institution, and we do health equity research. We do diversity, equity, inclusion research, particularly in connecting and engaging with community members, and bringing clinical trials and healthcare to them. And I feel like because of my polyculturalism, my biracial identity, I can be aware and open and move and navigate myself and not question and not have such a hard time absorbing or understanding why somebody might be thinking from other cultures type of thing. You know, I'm readily absorb that. But at the same time, just as the Black and Japanese identity, I think it's really important to remember yourself and center yourself. And I know that's easier said than done, but whenever I'm in these spaces, I try to say, because a lot of people will say, well, other people's perception and how other people will view you with somebody saying you're not Japanese. To me, it doesn't matter. I know, again, it's easier said than done, especially if you're younger, like high school, middle school age. So I'm not discounting that. It's just, I think we do need to, especially maybe as parents of Hafus, and Hafus ourselves, we need that build that confidence in that community of being Blasian. And so I am also kind of, as far as like us leaning into the coolness factor, I think it's also okay for somebody to just be Blasian and think that's cool. I think that's another thing too. So that builds that confidence, and because I feel like both in my American experience and my Japanese experience, that confidence factor of knowing who I am has played a big part in my comfort level of engaging. You know, somebody says, "Oh, nihongo shabarimasu ka?" Mochiron shabarimasu. That kind of thing. Like, of course I speak. You know, why are you questioning me? Type of thing. I shouldn't be. Oh yeah, of course I. And I think part of that mixed identity has allowed me to express sort of that being Japanese and being American at the same time. I sort of intermix that ability to be able to express myself in both cultures. So anyway, I don't want to, everybody has their lived experience, and I know we're all different generations and different backgrounds, but I do feel like we need to be okay to express ourselves as a Blasian and not worry too much about what others are saying about us.
No, thank you so much, Jabari, for pointing that out. And I think, I was trying to get at that in the presentation, but maybe I didn't do such a good job. But one of the slides, and I think it was a quote from Tricia actually, that says, I embody this racial polarity, but it kind of empowers her as well. So it's, so there's this sense of empowerment and building confidence. But for most people, it came over time. It was not, you're born that way, you're born cool, and that's it. I have this confidence. It really came over time, and usually closer to being an adult. And that's why social media and role models have really played a role in feeling more confident about who you are and feeling confident about your level of Japaneseness and your level of Blackness. And started using their Blasianness as a tool to empower themselves or to empower others. But I do want to reiterate, though, I think I said it really briefly in the presentation, is that people who did grow up in more diverse spaces, and if I remember correctly, I think you did, tend to have had a way more positive experience overall, because that gaze and that perception was not as traumatic, basically, as it were for others when they were kids. But I do agree that, parents of mixed race children have a huge responsibility, and a lot of them don't know that weight because they are not necessarily mixed race themselves. So
that's what I personally don't really understand, why I've been in such a beneficial place myself. I technically, yes, I did grow up sort of in a diverse situation when I was a child, but my father is from deep South Mississippi. Like, everybody around him is as Black as you can get. And then my mother is Tokyo. All her family's Japanese. There are no mixed people in either, but they fully embraced me, and I don't know why, but I am, like I said, I'm privileged in that sense. So I do understand that. And like I said, when I say these things, I don't want to discount or invalidate anybody else's experience, but I just don't think that it should be the main thought or the main process, particularly to somebody who is not Hafu or Blasian, that this is our experience and only we, like, there are a lot of great things that come out of it as well.
Of course.
I think if I could piggyback on some of what's being said here, I agree with Jabari in the sense that finding a sense of self is definitely key to things like self-esteem, self-efficacy. But I think that Maïko's presentation was much more focused on the journey to that place and the complexities that come with creating a sense of self and navigating a world in which we live in, because we don't live in a vacuum. And much of who we are comes from a reflection from the larger society to some extent, to some degree, which is why all of our experiences matter, our individual experiences matter, but so does the kind of social and collective experience of being Black and Japanese. So Maïko, I really saw your research as what the journey towards that strong sense of self, or a sense of self in general, like Jabari was identifying. Like I saw your research, Maïko, as the journey to that place. And so I really, again, appreciated how you identified all of so many of the elements from society, from the world that plays into the many different ways that us Hafu, Blackanese, Blasians can identify as, because there's a variety of the way we feel about who we are, what we look like, and how we move about the world.
Yes. No, thank you. I love how you put it, the journey towards that place. I think it might become the title of the book. It's really, really good, really well put. Thank you. We have, I think, a minute left. Does anyone else have a question or reaction?
I just want to say one last thing. What I've been thinking about recently is what's happened within this last decade, because I've been with my husband for 12 years. And when I first met my husband and I told everyone that he was Japanese, people would literally be like, "Oh, that's disgusting. I could never go out with an Asian guy." Like literally. And those same ladies are now saying, "Oh, has he got a brother?" So it's interesting, the evolution in just 10 years, or even, can I put forth the idea of just the last 4 years, or even the last 3 years, and how much it's changed with the perception of interracial dating, and most specifically interracial dating with let's say Asian and Black people, and how that dynamic and that perception has changed. I don't know if that can fit in anywhere, but for me, I just find that quite interesting as well.
Yeah, no, thank you. And there are some dating platforms that focus on Black and Asian dating, and which is, I found it very interesting. So specifically these two categories, that to make Blackanese cute babies, like that's kind of the slogan behind it, which is extremely problematic, but also interesting that that's such a trend that some people are like, I want a Blasian kid, like, or I want to be the Blasian couple. And I wonder if social media has played a role into that because of this trend, these hashtag Blackanese, hashtag Blasian kids, cute mixed kids, whatever. So it's very interesting, as Lisa, you just put it, that I think in the last few years, indeed, this trend has just skyrocketed. But it comes from a place of love, but it's also as problematic as, this idea of, because it comes from this idea of phenotypes and, mixing of different races to make something new, kind of. We are, I think, at time. So I don't want to take people's time too much, but thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Thank you to my participants today for showing up and sharing your your thoughts and being there with me throughout this process. And there's plenty more participants, but we could only accommodate so many. But I'm truly grateful for your time and sharing your stories with me. And I hope more will come soon. As you know, I'm expecting a baby myself, so things will slow down a little bit on my end, but I hope to pick up eventually as well. And thank you so much, everyone. And feel free to contact me. Let me write my email down. So if you want to reach out to me with more comments or feedback later on, you can as well.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.